Disclaimer: this isn't my story, but it's from a good friend of mine. Let's call her Jess for this instance. It still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. My friend Jess was once driving back home from her parents' house through a rural area in southern Germany. It was late at night and the ride had been relatively quiet, until the road ahead was suddenly blocked by what she described as a large log. She was super annoyed because this was literally the only road she could take to get back home without driving an extra hour or so to find another route. When she got out of the car to inspect the roadblock, she didn't notice anything unusual. Germany is pretty tame when it comes to wildlife in rural areas, so there's usually no serious wildlife encounters apart from hedgehogs or maybe a deer. She decided to move the log out of the way. I'm not sure how long it took her, but by the time she was finished, another car had stopped not far behind her. She assumed the driver was waiting for her to clear the road and continue driving. At least, that's what she thought. As soon as she got back into the driver's seat and continued her journey, she noticed that the car behind her was following closely. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence. On a single road with nowhere else to go, it made sense that the car would be taking the same route. But things got weird as soon as she entered the next town, and the car was still behind her. Starting to panic, Jess called the police to report the situation, telling them she was heading home so they could intercept the stranger once she arrived. She was already close to her house, but knew it might take the police a few minutes to get there. To avoid leading the stranger directly to her door, she decided to park a few houses away to avoid suspicion. She stayed in the driver's seat, watching to see if the other car would pass by, but it didn't. Instead, the driver parked directly behind her. By this point, Jess was extremely anxious. She locked her doors, grabbed her pepper spray, and waited. A man got out of the car and approached her window, waving and gesturing toward the back of her car. Confused, Jess rolled her window down just a crack to ask what he wanted. The man explained that when she got out to move the log, he saw a stranger sneak into her trunk and was trying to warn her. Jess was absolutely bewildered and terrified. At first, she didn't believe him, but then the man showed her his phone and confirmed he'd already called the police. This gave her enough trust to step out of the car while remaining cautious. Jess cursed happily while trying to concentrate on staying attentive. Not long after, the police arrived. They opened her trunk and found the stranger hiding inside. He was promptly arrested. It turned out the man who had followed her was telling the truth. He had only been following her to ensure her safety and alert her to the danger. As for the guy in the trunk, while I don't have all the details, I've been told he definitely had ill intentions, likely planning to follow her home and break in, or worse. Since hearing Jess's story, I've never driven with my car unlocked. The ones I've driven don't lock automatically, and always check every window and the trunk before getting inside. It's just that my previous life had been routine and boring. The car Jess drove at the time was a Skoda Octavia, meaning the trunk was directly connected to the front of the car. This makes it even scarier because the guy could have crawled into the back seat at any moment. I was maybe 8, which would make my sister 12. My brother wasn't born yet. I'm 9 years older than him, so this had to be before then. Our parents were out for their anniversary dinner, which meant they'd be gone until probably midnight. My sister was very responsible and capable of babysitting me. I didn't find out until years later, but apparently my parents had warned my sister that our grandma, my dad's mom, was manic depressive, which is old-timey talk for bipolar. They told her that grandma was mad at my dad for holding some kind of boundary with her, and specifically said not to let her in or even respond if she came by the house. They booked. Of course, none of this was communicated to me. How could you tell an 8-year-old something like that? Anyway, a couple of hours into the evening, we heard a knock on the door. My sister immediately shushed me and held her finger to her lips. "Robbie, I know you're in there. Robbie, come open the door." I remember it like it was yesterday. I could tell it was my grandma, but I could also tell that something wasn't right. My sister moved us to the hallway, where we sat quietly, out of sight of any windows. Grandma kept pounding on the door, demanding my dad let her in. Then it went quiet for a while. I started to relax a bit. Of course, that didn't last. Suddenly, a bedroom window started getting slammed, and my grandma sounded like a fucking demon screaming for my dad. I've never heard such anger since. She moved across the house, pounding on every window. If she hadn't been so old, I'm sure she would have broken a window with the sheer force of her fury. Then it went quiet again, but now I knew better than to relax. We huddled together in the hallway in complete silence. I was shaking like a leaf, and so was my sister. This grandma had played twisted games with my sister in the past to hurt my parents, like taking her to the mall, going to the register with some jewelry and then saying, "Never mind," or buying the same jewelry for our cousin instead. Seriously twisted shit. As I'm typing this, I'm realizing I definitely need to talk to my therapist about it. So it had been quiet for a while. Then, out of nowhere, we heard Grandma putting on this sweet, sweet voice, directly addressing us and trying to coax us with candy to open the door. She always had a shit ton of candy around, since she was a diabetic in serious denial. This was the most surreal experience. It was like Satan himself had just been screaming, and now she sounded like a sweet old granny again. She almost got me. Thankfully, my sister was wise beyond her years and held me tightly. Manu Nazuki. Audio cramophobe porn. Finally, it was quiet for about an hour, and my sister said it was time for bed. My bedroom faced the backyard, which had a pool and a high wall. Beyond that was a vast, empty field with an old railroad track running through it. I was used to hearing coyotes, foxes, and other animals outside. Right as I was winding down to fall asleep, the absolute loudest scratching started on my window. Like Freddy Krueger himself was trying to claw his way in. In the moonlight, it was a full moon that night, I could see the silhouette of my grandma. If there was ever a day I would see her again until her next. I haven't thought about this in years and my hair is standing on end just typing it. Holy shit. No other windows were scratched that night, just mine. Then, it was over. I woke up the next day and my sister was telling our parents all about it. I couldn't even be in the room while it was being discussed. A few weeks later, Grandma died from an E. coli infection. She died like Elvis, on the toilet. At her viewing, they put her in one of her classic flowy blouses. A breeze lifted it up slightly, and one of my cousins screamed, "She's alive," and ran away, she said. My grandmother, little to no hair, shouted for her husband to look after Maud. After the funeral, I told my mom and dad that I was glad Grandma was gone. According to my mom, I said, "Grandma really stressed me out." She later told me no child my age should have to say their grandma stressed them out. Oh, Mom, she did more than stress me out. She terrified me more than any horror film, scary story, or freaky night in the woods ever could. And I had plenty of those with my dad, who was an absolute wild mountain man. Both of my parents are gone now, and I wish I had told them more about my experience that night, but I trust that my sister told them what they needed to know. Now, I have a 4-year-old daughter, and my wife's parents are the complete opposite of my grandparents. Both sides of my family have seriously fucked up histories. I cry when I look at pictures of her with her grandma and grandpa at their farm, riding a horse or chasing a chicken. I'm so glad she gets to have the classic grandparent experience. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be talking to my therapist about this. P.S. I don't want anyone to think I believe mental illness equals violence. My wife and I both work in mental health, And despite my personal experiences with my psycho granny, I don't project that onto anyone else who suffers from mental illness. It manifests in so many ways, the vast majority of which are not violent. In fact, mentally ill people are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. Please be kind here. I don't like to tell this story because I feel like no one will believe me. I'm relatively new to Reddit, but seeing others share their experiences here made me finally think maybe it's time I tell mine. Side note, my friends' names have been changed for this story as they are still together and very reluctant to ever bring this up. Last. This must have been around 2007. One night, two friends and I were out ghost hunting in a very remote little town in western NY. My friend Jane wanted to take a couple more pictures in the old cemetery, so her boyfriend John and I waited in my SUV while she did her thing. It must have been around midnight, and we were parked on a back road. There were some streetlights up ahead. Jane was behind us and off to the right, but we could still see her flashlight. John and I happened to be looking up the road when, about 65 yards ahead, something stepped out from under the streetlight on the left-hand side. It was a black figure wearing a wide-brim hat. It just appeared. It was blacker than black, more like a void than a physical being. It wasn't a person, 100%. There were no features, just pure darkness, but we could make out the hat from the profile. It was a flat-top hat with a wide brim. On my mother's grave, I swear it took maybe 30 steps before it began to morph. That's the only word I can use to describe it. By the time it reached the streetlight on the opposite side of the road, it had transformed into the shape of a black cat. But even as a cat, it was still a void, just as black as before. Then it disappeared into the field beyond the streetlight. John and I sat in silence, staring at each other for about 2 minutes before either of us could speak. Finally, John broke the silence. "You saw that too, didn't you?" He continued sitting there, frozen in awe and terror. Not long after, Jane returned to the car. I couldn't even move to unlock the doors. I finally managed to move my hand, just enough to hit the unlock button to let her in. She jokingly said, "You both look like you saw the devil himself." John, who was a huge guy, tall, muscular, and intimidating, was shaking and in tears. All he could say was, "Cat!" Jonathan stepped forward and picked up the lantern. I struggled to explain to Jane what had happened, but could barely form the words. It was about a 35-minute drive back home, and Jane kept saying things like, "This isn't funny anymore. You guys are scaring me." When we got back, John insisted we stop at his church. Once there, we said a prayer to Mother Mary at the outdoor statue. While he continued praying, I tried to explain to Jane what we had seen. I remember how crazy I sounded, even to myself as I described it. To this day, the memory sends chills down my spine. Whatever it wasn't of this earth. That's the only thing I'm certain of. A part of me desperately wants answers, but another part of me feels like it's better not to know. Years later, Jane and I reconnected. That night was always the elephant in the room, so we finally talked about it. She told me that after the incident, all the crosses in her mom's house randomly turned upside down for weeks. It only stopped after Jane's mom went through the house in deep prayer and blessed it. At the time, Jane and John were living with her mom. Did something follow them home? I've never seen anything like it since, and I pray I never will. Edit. Just days after I posted this, my cat died in my arms from a sudden medical emergency. To make things stranger, Jane's 8-year-old dog died earlier that same day, only about 12 hours apart. My cat was 16, but I can't help but wonder if telling this story somehow brought something on. I wrote about my disturbed cousin before, but I'll write about him again with a bit more detail. For the sake of anonymity, I'll refer to my cousin as JJ. and I are the same age, and when I was little, he lived in the same apartment complex as me and my parents. He lived with his mom, older sister, and younger sister. His mother never fully disclosed who Jay's father was, but whoever he was never around. From an early age, Jay displayed disturbing and violent behaviors. They had to get rid of their pets because Jay would harm them. He was destructive with his toys and didn't enjoy playing normally with other children. He hated me greatly and would sometimes try to get physical, but I returned the same energy. He soon realized I wasn't the one to mess with, and his assaults toward me became more verbal. Once, while riding in the back of his mom's station wagon together, he threatened to open the door and kick me out while the car was moving. I told him I could do the same to him. He said he hated me, and I told him he was just angry because he couldn't hurt me. We were 6 years old. One day, his mom called my mom from the children's hospital. Jay had pushed his little sister down the stairs. He thought it was funny that she was injured and said he was disappointed she didn't die. His mom spanked him, but he didn't cry. She then took him to church for prayer. His behavior didn't change. On one weekend, Jay's older teenage sister Dee came to visit us. She looked stressed, and her toe was bandaged. My mom asked her what was wrong, and she confided in us that Jay had become more violent. He was attacking them regularly, sometimes with sharp objects. It was so bad that they had to lock their doors at night to feel safe sleeping. My mom asked what had happened to her toe. Jay told us that Jay had hit her foot with a clothing iron and knocked her toenail completely off. She showed us the horrific wound. My mom talked to Jay's mom about it, but she said that nothing she did discipline-wise seemed to work. She even confessed that she was afraid of her own son. Jay's behavior continued to be violent and erratic. My mom and I visited less and less, even though they lived in the same apartment complex. Dee, however, would visit us frequently for a mental break. One weekend, late at night, we were woken up by the sound of sirens and the smell of smoke. Of course, everyone was on alert, and we all headed outside. To our horror, it was Jay's family's apartment ablaze. By God's grace, they all made it out safely. We later found out that the fire had been set by Jay on purpose. He used one of his mom's lighters. After setting the fire, he stood outside eating a bag of chips, watching it burn while his family was still inside. The apartment complex kicked them out, and they had to move back in with Jay's grandmother. To our knowledge, Jay's mom tried to get him some form of counseling, but she wasn't consistent. She was a single mom and worked a lot, leaving Jay and his little sister in Dee's care. She didn't really keep in contact with us or other extended family after that. Many years later, we found out that Jay had murdered someone and landed in prison. I wasn't surprised. As a child, he displayed clear psychopathic tendencies. I've always felt that he should have been committed to a facility early on, when the first signs of his disturbed behavior surfaced. At this point, none of Jay's immediate family speaks to him. They treat him as if he never existed. Plenty of parents probably do still treat their children very badly when they find out things like this. But Jay materially requires many resources. This story is rather short because, as I get older, I'm slowly losing more and more memory of what exactly happened. I want to tell it while I still remember what's left of it because I don't think I'll ever forget the police with the glowing red eyes. I was really young, maybe 15 or 16. My mom and I were playing video games. It was dark outside and my dad was at work. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. This part I remember clearly. Knock, knock, knock. I went over to look through the peephole and saw nothing. I figured it must have been the neighbors, so I went back to playing games. My mom was now in the kitchen, making dinner or something. Then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time I heard a voice, loud and clear. "It's the police. Please open the door." I looked out the peephole again and saw two completely black shrouded figures with glowing red eyes. We had a little porch light outside, so it should have illuminated their features, but it didn't. They weren't skin-tone black. They looked like shadows. It's tough to explain. Anyway, I was freaked out. I went to my mom and told her, "It's the police." She walked to the door and said, "Hello? Who is it?" Again, we heard the knocking. Knock, knock, knock. "It's the police," the same voice said, in the exact same tone as before. My mom got this suspicious look on her face, then glanced through the peephole. The moment she saw them, her expression dropped. I could tell she saw what I saw. She looked at me and whispered, "Get down." I obeyed. She asked again, "What do you need? What can I do for you?" This time there was no response, just silence. Then, another knock, knock, knock. At this point, she went to get her phone. Being a dumb kid, I looked through the peephole again. They were closer now. Their red eyes seemed to glow even brighter, and the porch light was gone. It was just darkness and those silhouettes. I screamed, genuinely terrified. My mom rushed back, a knife in her hand, while I hid behind the couch. She was on the phone with my dad, trying to explain the situation the best she could. Of course, he thought she was crazy, but said he was on his way. Then she called the cops. While she was on the phone, the banging on the door got louder. Knock, knock, knock. "It's the police. Please open up." She yelled, "Go away, I have a gun." She didn't. All she had was the knife, and I, being the dumb kid I was, had grabbed a knife from the kitchen without her noticing. To be honest, I don't remember much after that. I remember looking through the peephole again, my mom looking too, and then her screaming as she pushed me away from the door, and then it just stopped. I looked one last time and they were gone. I'll always remember this. If you want more details, please don't hesitate to ask. I really want to remember as much as I can before my memory of this fades. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you believe me about the red-eyed police. It started a few weeks ago when I moved into my new apartment. The place was old but cheap, which is why I jumped on it. The landlord warned me about the basement though. He said it was off limits. Just a storage area, he told me, not safe to go down there. But curiosity got the better of me. One night, I heard faint noises coming from the basement. Scratching, almost like someone was trying to get out. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but the sound kept growing louder, like a muffled voice whispering my name. I was home alone. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously went down the stairs. The basement was freezing, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I scanned the room, but all I found were dusty boxes and old furniture. Then, I heard it. Soft whispers, just behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart raced, and I ran back upstairs, slamming the door behind me. That night, the whispers became clearer. I didn't sleep at all, terrified by what had just happened. I calmed down from that. The next day, I asked the landlord about it. He looked at me with wide eyes and said, "You shouldn't have gone down there. That basement, it's not what you think." I haven't heard the whispers since, but I swear, sometimes, late at night, I can still feel them, watching me, waiting for me to go back. This story might be hard to believe, but it happened. It's your choice whether you want to believe it or not. I'm just here to share what I experienced. This happened to my mother when she was in her teens. Her mom had just gotten the family a Ouija board as a present. She had played with one as a child and thought it was interesting and fun. It was a Sunday evening when this took place. My mom's best friend came over to her house, and her older sister's friend was also there. The four of them sat at the dining room table, playing with the Ouija board and asking it various questions. Who will I marry? What will my husband look like? What kind of job will I have? And so on. At first, the answers were normal, but then they became erratic. One or more of them began to suspect that someone might be trying to influence the board. They decided to stop for a moment, and everyone kept their hands still on the planchette. Then one of them asked who was really in control of this board. My mom's hands were on the planchette when she suddenly felt a sharp jerk. The other person's hands were barely touching it. The planchette began moving quickly and spelled out Satan in deliberate, forceful motions. Then it stopped. They were shocked and started arguing. Some accused my mom of pushing it, while others insisted she didn't. As they argued, they all turned their heads to the left, away from the board, to where my mom was sitting. Suddenly, without any noticeable puff of air or breeze, the candle on the right side of the table went out on its own. The sudden extinguishing of the candle scared them so badly that they all jumped up and ran outside to the porch of the church across the street. It was late Sunday night after services, so the doors were locked and no one was there. They sat on the porch talking and trying to make sense of what had just happened before eventually working up the courage to walk back to the house. From that day forward, my mom never touched a Ouija board again. A couple of years ago, I posted something on an online group for the city I live in. It was just asking for places to go to meet people. Some of the posts were helpful. One of them was a guy saying he wanted to make friends. He said we could chat. We ended up talking and getting along really well. He had a job, a car, his own house, and 2 dogs. Also, he was 7 years older than me. He had similar interests to me, and we talked from a Friday to a Sunday. On Saturday night, his vibe got weird for some reason. For example, he wanted to meet in person eventually. He would say it had to be during the day, but then it suddenly was about meeting at night. Previously, he would say he was too tired from work to hang out then. I started to get a bad vibe when he said his last relationship had been 8 years. He also kept saying, "This feels too good to be true," and "I don't want to enter a relationship unless it's serious," but would send kissy emojis and talk about our future. On Sunday night is when things got weird. I went to get dinner at a local restaurant. This guy was there, and I was getting a weird vibe from him. He started looking at me and then sat at my table. I asked if I knew him, and he seemed upset and said I should have recognized him. He said we knew each other from online, and I asked if he was the guy I met online. He said he was. I didn't know what to do, so I went with him as if he was the guy. It seemed okay. Suddenly, things took a turn when he told me he hadn't had a job, needed a place to live, kept getting my name wrong, was walking in the direction of my house, talking about drugs and knives, and he also kept talking about how I should have been under the ground. Also, when he mentioned the drugs and knives, he was saying stuff about us being together forever, how some of the things he told me online were his plans for us, and that it wouldn't hurt. I eventually left him at a corner, waiting for a taxi. He watched me for 3 blocks, and I haven't seen him since. Also, I realized I had seen him before. I'd seen him at a bus stop, and it was weird. I texted the guy I met on the forum, and he said it wasn't him. However, just to be safe, I deactivated my Reddit. I tried to find that Reddit account again with a new account. It also was deactivated. To this day, I have no idea who he is. I realized I kept seeing him before. I've never seen him since. TL. A guy approached me saying he's someone I met online. I went with him and it got creepy. The guy denied it online and I deactivated my account. Later, I looked up the account I was talking to and it can't be found. I've never seen the guy that approached me ever again. I saw a creature in the woods that didn't want me there. I apologize if my grammar isn't perfect. I'm writing this on my phone after just waking up because for some reason I can't get this off my mind lately. When I was younger, I loved going on walks in the woods. I'd go on walks almost every morning and never really thought about what could be out there. I always strolled through the woods behind my house, which seemed to stretch on forever. One day, I walked farther than I ever had before. I was restless that day and full of energy, so I decided to keep going and enjoy the beautiful scenery. After some time, I came to a clearing with a big rotted log in the center. It was beautiful. The forest floor looked unnaturally clean, almost as if it had been vacuumed, like a perfect carpet. The sunlight streamed through the treetops in just the right way, illuminating the area. I wanted to take it all in, so I sat down on the rotted log. Everything felt warm and inviting, yet strangely sharp and sinister at the same time, though maybe I only remember it that way now, as a warning to myself never to go back there. At first, the clearing was full of life. I heard birds chirping and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Then, all of a sudden, the joy seemed to drain from the place. The sun disappeared behind clouds, and the sounds of nature vanished. It wasn't just silence, it was empty. The air felt heavy, and I was overcome with this oppressive feeling, like there was no happiness left in the world. I hadn't even seen anything yet, but I was already terrified. Then I heard it. Far up the hill, deeper into the forest, a branch snapped. It wasn't a small noise, it was deliberate, loud. It felt like whatever was up there wanted me to know it was there. At the same time, I got this sinking feeling that it knew I was there too. Like I had wandered into its territory where I didn't belong. For a few long, cold moments, nothing happened. Then I heard it, whatever it was, bolting down the hill. It wasn't a normal sound. It wasn't the way an animal or a person would run. It was violent, chaotic, and impossibly fast. Question 4. And then I saw it. It was just wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. It didn't look like any creature I had ever seen. It looked like a monster, but even then it didn't look right. Its body was warped and uneven. Its skin stretched unnaturally over its form, like it didn't fit. There was no mouth or eyes, just depressions on its face, where they should have been. It ran on all fours, but its movements were jagged and unpredictable, zigzagging so fast it almost didn't seem real. Sharp bones jutted out at odd angles all over its body. I didn't stare for long, I couldn't. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. But it was gaining on me. I swear, this thing must have been running 30 miles per hour and I was just a kid. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves behind me and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Somehow, I made it to the road that led to my house, just as a car passed by. I turned and saw the creature crawling back up the hill in its bizarre, zigzagging pattern. I couldn't stop staring at the tree line as I ran along the opposite side of the road, not stopping until I got home. By the time I made it back, my legs were spasming and bruised, but I didn't care. I was safe. For now. I've never gone on a walk alone since that day. I still don't know what it was. A skinwalker? A Wendigo? Something else entirely? I have no idea, and not knowing terrifies me. I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, if it's still hunting me, and I've just been lucky so far. I swear this is real. Ever since this encounter, I've been completely invested in hearing other people's stories about strange creatures. I understand the feeling of thinking no one will believe you because it sounds so insane. If anyone reading this has an idea of what I might have seen, please let me know. I just want to understand what happened to me that day. Thanks for reading, and I hope whoever sees this stays safe. Okay, this happened 2 days ago. It was really insane and odd at the time it happened. I was getting ready for work. It was pretty windy outside and my family forgot to close the balcony door to the patio. I headed over to close it only to hear screaming and shouting. The noises were coming from behind my house, about 2 houses down to the left. Sorry, I'm not good at describing. I could hear a guy, probably in his mid-20s, screaming at the top of his lungs at what I assume was his family. I could hear his mom crying and his dad yelling as well. He checked. The guy started shouting that it was his birthday, that he had just come back from work, and that he never expected this. I'm guessing he didn't expect a surprise or something, because the next thing he said was that he didn't want them to be in the house. Then I heard his dad trying to calm him down, but literally the next phrases from the guy sent chills down my spine. He started shouting repeatedly that he was going to murder everyone in the house. He was yelling so loudly and with so much anger that the sound could be heard throughout the entire neighborhood. It was so unsettling because my neighborhood is usually one of the quietest in the city, so this whole situation felt both scary and surreal. I had to leave for work, so I couldn't stay to see what happened next. Around 9 p.m., about 5 hours after the incident, I was driving back from work when I saw 3 or 4 police cars parked down the road. I went straight home, worried about what might have happened. When I got home, I learned from my siblings that the guy had apparently self-harmed because the unwanted guests wouldn't leave. What made the situation even scarier was that the guy told the cops he wanted the guests gone because they were part of a cult. He claimed they were trying to brainwash him and his parents. Hearing about all of this happening in my usually quiet neighborhood was unsettling and downright terrifying. Exercise has many benefits, Lerner wrote. At the age of 4, I was placed into a family through the foster care system. I spent 10 years being moved back and forth between there and my biological mother, ultimately being adopted by the original family I was placed with, a cult. People often laugh nervously when I mention being brought up in a cult, try to change the subject, or assume I'm joking. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Let me explain how they operated to give you some context. The rules: no outside communication, no association with anyone outside of the organization. Call 911 every time for calls, at least 2,000 calls. Mandatory servitude. A minimum of 70+ hours per month was required. No extracurricular activities, sports, art, drama, shop classes, none of it was allowed. No smoking or drinking of any kind, ever. No unarranged relationships. Every relationship had to be pre-approved. Their beliefs on punishment were straight out of the Old Testament, to say the least. There were also strict gender roles. Women were not allowed to speak in meetings unless spoken to or called upon. Women were not allowed to work unless absolutely necessary and approved by the elders. All medical paperwork had to be turned in, and reporting crimes, even extreme ones, was strictly forbidden. Now that the background is out of the way, let me begin. I'm 24 now, and I can't shake the feeling that something is still attached to me. Whole days go missing from my memory. I wake up in random places, and something is following me. When I turned 18, I ran away as soon as I legally could. But the trauma didn't stay behind. Or at least, I thought it was just trauma. It wasn't even a full night before the nightmares started. Horribly graphic dreams of violent rituals, sacrifices, and running. Not from something I could see, but from an overwhelming sense of dread. A couple of weeks later, the following started. I'd noticed people in all black, with faces I couldn't make out, trailing me as I walked home from college. Sometimes, there were so many of them it felt impossible to choose a safe route home. I was terrified. I'd bought a taser shortly after that, hoping it would give me some sense of security. For weeks, I barely slept. My life was a constant state of fear and exhaustion. I went through multiple mental health evaluations, desperate to understand what was happening to me. But nothing ever came of them. No diagnoses, no explanations. Then, a few months into all of this, things changed again. I started sleeping more than I ever had in my life. Days would disappear. I went to sleep on November 6th, 2019, and didn't coherently wake up until the 9th. I had no dreams during that time, but when I woke up, I was covered in bruises and had deep scratches down my chest. I couldn't explain it, and it terrified me. Since then, I've surrounded myself with every form of spiritual protection I can think of. Crystals, protection spells, rituals. But none of it seems to work. Every time I wake up, there's this thing, a black cloud. It looks like burning plastic and just hovers. It's always there. I wish I could say this was all just some creepy story or a bad joke, but it's not. This has been my reality for the past 5 years. Does anyone have a similar experience or any idea how to make this stop? I'm desperate for answers. I'm not gonna hurt you. Remembering those words still sends chills up my spine. This happened a few years ago. My 33-ohm husband, 43-ohm, and I were getting gas late one night. It was at a strange gas station located where two roads intersected at an angle, with a station positioned at the acute corner. If you can picture it, our pump was tucked in a spot where it was hard to see directly from either road. On top of that, there were no working lights near our pump, making it especially dark. We were driving a soft-top Jeep Wrangler with all the rear windows removed. My husband got out to pump gas while I stayed in the passenger seat, scrolling on my phone. That's when I heard it. "I'm not going to hurt you," said a wavery voice from somewhere behind me. I froze. Fear gripped me immediately. Slowly, I turned around to look out the open space where the rear window used to be. Standing a little distance away was what appeared to be a homeless man. He had slightly wild gray hair, a washed-out beanie, and an oversized jacket with multiple pockets, his hands hidden inside. The darkness of the station suddenly felt oppressive, and my stomach dropped when I realized I couldn't see his hands. A feeling washed over me, a primal, almost audible instinct deep within, a feeling of physical primalness, a healthy and natural protection that had somehow cried to me to run to my father. Gun? But we were just pumping gas. It was just a weird guy, right? My husband and I were from Key West, a place where seeing eccentric or homeless people wasn't uncommon. They were usually harmless. I shook it off and turned back around, pretending to focus on my phone. Yet I couldn't ignore him. I could hear the faint shuffling of his feet and the rustle of his jacket as he moved closer. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said again, his voice a little closer this time. "I just need some help. Do you have any money? I'm not going to hurt you." "Sir?" At this point, he was almost at the Jeep. I glanced at the gas pump, realizing there was no way the tank was full yet. We'd only been there a couple of minutes, and we'd come in on almost empty. Panic bubbled up inside me. But before I could say anything, my husband suddenly bolted back into the car. His hands were shaking as he fumbled to start the engine. He threw the car into drive and we peeled out of there. As we sped away, I turned to look back. The man stood motionless next to the pump, staring at us, not reacting. The gas nozzle dangled from the Jeep, swinging where my husband hadn't bothered to hang it back up. As we turned out of the station, my husband finally broke the silence. "I just had the most horrible feeling," he said, his voice shaky. "Something told me to run." "Something told me to run," I replied, and after it, I could see no footprints. I looked at him in horror. "I felt the same thing," I whispered. Tears welled up in my eyes. and I thanked him over and over for listening to his instincts. We drove home, shaken, replaying the events and the overwhelming fear we had felt. A couple of days later, we watched a YouTube video by security analyst Scott Stewart about the Kenyan mall shooting. In the video, he explained that in events like these, survivors often report a terrible feeling right before the incident, an instinctual sense that something bad was about to happen. He added that some people act on that feeling and leave, while others ignore it and later regret not listening. Hearing that, I burst into tears. I knew exactly what he was describing. I had felt that same primal warning, but I ignored it. I remember crying, "Thank you," to my husband for trusting his gut and getting us out of there. Now, it's entirely possible that the man at the gas station was just a harmless person, asking for money in an unintentionally creepy way. Maybe nothing bad would have happened. But I can't stop thinking about the details. There was nothing creepy about his act. How the gas station's layout made it impossible for anyone to see us. The crowds, being that thick on Monday, had squatted near the parking lot for half an hour. How dark it was. How his hands were hidden the entire time. And I'll never forget the chilling sound of his voice. "I'm not going to hurt you." Moral of the story: if you ever get that distinct feeling that something bad is about to happen, trust your instincts and leave. It might be a false alarm, but it's far better than spending the rest of your life wishing you'd listen.